Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. I'm your host, Kev Cooling, and today I'm doing something a little different. No guest, it's just me. I want to share some tips with you that, in my experience, make a really big difference when an organization is trying to get serious about reducing its carbon emissions. Now, these tips come from over 20 years working in carbon management, and I've distilled these and others in more detail into a couple of hack books that I've written, one on governance and one on leadership. And the intention is that I'll do a series of these hack books and maybe one day bring them all together to make a real book. Anyway, if you want to go deeper on any of this stuff, the hack books are free to download, and I'll put the links in the show notes. So the problem for which these tips offer a solution is that most organizations have the will to want to reduce their carbon emissions. And in fact, I would say the majority of organizations, large organizations, have set themselves some kind of target to do just that. And in fact, many organizations in kind of the SME scale have also done it too. But of course, many of them, whilst they've got those targets, struggle to turn that into meaningful, consistent, measurable action. And the kind of gap between, well, we care about net zero, we care about reducing our carbon emissions, and actual emissions going down is where the organization loses years of the period that it's got to make those savings. And of course, don't forget that we've got a hard stop effectively in 2050 if what we want to do is reduce our emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change actually coming to pass. And hopefully, if you're listening to this podcast, you kind of agree with me that that's a pretty important target that we need to try and achieve. So bear in mind, these three tips that I'm going to run through with you in a moment, they're not the only things that matter, but they are the things that I see overlooked very often, and they're really foundational to making the progress that you want to see. So tip one is about governance and about getting that right, getting the kind of nuts and bolts of making people care about carbon emissions in their day-to-day work. The second tip is about leadership and culture, and about the effect that has on everybody throughout the organization, recognizing, of course, that you kind of need most people to be on board with this target. And the third is kind of a mindset shift that, if you're in the weeds of trying to make this stuff happen, will probably save you time and energy. So, I mean, I suppose a fair question would be, why should you listen to me? Why are these tips better than any of the tips you might find anywhere else? And you'll probably find these tips in other places, I guess. But I mean, I've worked with organizations of many shapes and sizes over the years. I've worked with Lloyds Bank, I've worked with the University of Cambridge, University of Oxford, I've worked with PwC, I've worked with family-run manufacturers of health food products. I've worked with kind of national student accommodation providers here in the UK. So I've done work with a lot of different people in and around the area of carbon reduction over those years. So maybe that's a good reason to listen to me. I don't know, maybe you just like my voice. Who knows? I don't think anybody's ever told me I've got a lovely voice, but if you think that's the case, let me know in the comments. I'd be thrilled to hear that. Anyway, okay, so tip one, make somebody accountable for carbon reduction and actually mean it. And that's the key here, really. I'm going to start with what might seem like an obvious statement. Someone in your organization needs to be responsible for carbon emissions and reducing them. But here's the thing. Most organizations have already done that bit. They've given somebody the job title, they've added it to their job description, maybe they've even put it in their contract. Maybe they've issued a press release about it, who knows? And then not a lot happens. Why is that? Well, because responsibility without accountability is almost meaningless. So let's just have a think about the relationship between responsibility and accountability. So responsibility is about being given the job, but accountability is there being a real consequence if you don't do it. So these two things aren't the same, and conflating them is one of the most common mistakes that I see made in organizations. So you give somebody the job title and then you don't effectively hold them to account when they don't achieve the things that you need them to achieve. And you wouldn't do that in other aspects of your business. You wouldn't do it for finances. You wouldn't make the financial director responsible for budget performance and then not meaningfully discuss it in their appraisal, right? That would be madness. So why do people do it with carbon emissions? I mean, I don't know why they do that. I'm just suggesting that they shouldn't. So what does that look like in practice, that kind of accountability gap? What typically happens is someone is responsible for net zero, and very often this is not their sole responsibility. And I guess probably I'm talking about cases where that's true. You know, somebody is doing something else, but they get carbon emissions and kind of maybe more broadly sustainability sort of tacked on to their responsibilities. So they get that, they've got that responsibility, but when appraisal time comes around, it doesn't appear on the agenda of their appraisal. It doesn't appear on their balanced scorecard. It isn't a material part of the discussion. Quite often there'll be a bit of an awkward conversation. Oh, you know that target we had to reduce our emissions by 5% or 10% this year, or whatever it might be. It's a bit of a shame that we didn't do that. Anyway, let's talk about the budget of your department. So you kind of have this awkward conversation, maybe a nod to the fact that targets are missed, and then everyone moves on to what they see as the more important stuff. And you know that phrase, the important stuff, tells you everything about where emissions actually sits in the hierarchy of priorities for many, many organizations. So here's what genuine accountability looks like. So the carbon targets for that part of the organization for which the individual is responsible, and ideally you'd have somebody accountable for this right at the C-suite, right at the very top, so you talk about the entire organization. They would be responsible for the performance of that carbon target. And if it isn't met, then there is a material impact for that individual. So that might be a material impact to the level of bonus they get. It might be a material impact to maybe their actual remuneration, their pay, their base pay, or in fact, their progression. It's not just a difficult conversation. It has a meaningful, tangible effect on the person who's got that accountability. Now, it sounds harsh. I know it sounds harsh, but apply the same logic to other business risk. So health and safety or financial performance. And it's not controversial at all. It's exactly what happens. If you had somebody who was responsible for health and safety in the organization, and there was, heaven forbid, a serious injury or an environmental damage, or, you know, somebody even died, then is that person going to get promoted? Or is that person going to get a big bonus? Or at least is the bonus going to be the same size as it would have been if there had been no health and safety incidents? I certainly hope not. And it should be exactly the same with carbon emissions. And using a balanced scorecard approach, since this is kind of an incidental thing, I suppose, but using a balanced scorecard approach, it means that the weighting that you give to carbon can reflect the individual's level of agency and the scale of their impact. Because you don't necessarily want to just have accountability at the highest level. Yeah, that's really important, and it has to be a meaningful conversation there as well. But you can cascade accountability, dispersing it down through the organization. So once you've established that accountability at the top, cascade it downwards. And of course, that accountability becomes more granular the further down you go. But the principle holds at every level. What's important, though, is you're consistent. So don't hold one department head, for example, to account while another at the same level isn't, because that can lead to resentment and cynicism. But nonetheless, it is worth remembering that some departments, some areas of your organization will likely have an increased level of impact when it comes to GHG emissions than others. So think about that kind of level of impact, level of agency, and so on. Of course, there's a practical limit to how far you can cascade accountability, because whilst it's cost effective and it's relatively straightforward to measure the business's overall carbon emissions and hold your C-suite member to account, that's fine. But as you go further down the organization, it becomes less and less easy and less cost effective to measure the individual's carbon impact. So you need to judge how far to go before you stop. But do aim to go as far down as is feasible, as is reasonably practicable, to borrow an expression from our health and safety colleagues. So here's the first thing you do. Check whether the person responsible for emissions in your organizations right now actually has it on their scorecard. Is it something that's materially going to impact them if they don't achieve the things that they've been said to do? If they don't, that's your first action. Fix that before you do anything else. So tip 1 in a sentence. Don't just give somebody responsibility for net zero. Give them something they can aim at and tie something meaningful to it. And then cascade that accountability as widely as you practically can. And that's how you move from good intentions to actual results. Okay, tip 2. Leaders have to walk the talk every day. This one sits right at the intersection of governance and culture. You can have the best accountability structures in the world, but if your senior leaders aren't visibly living the values your organization claims to hold around sustainability, it will unravel, and it will unravel fast. You may have heard of this concept of the shadow leaders cast, behaviors that they model. And the truth is that leaders, whether they intend to or not, set the cultural temperature and direction for everybody else in the business. So what they prioritize, what they talk about, how they behave, all of it is watched and interpreted by staff as signals about what really matters within the organization. And this applies to carbon just as much as it applies to anything else in the business. So you have to make sure that your leaders are behaving in a way that aligns with your sustainability, or more focused, your carbon reduction goals. And of course, you can help them do that by having them be accountable for the carbon emissions associated with the bit of the business that they are leading. Here's a good example. So let's say your organization launches a salary sacrifice scheme for electric vehicles, because commuting and grey fleet business travel is a big part of your carbon footprint. So you think, you know what, encourage people to get EVs. That will help us in a number of ways. It's in the long run cheaper for the employee, but also better for the environment, and it's going to reduce the carbon emissions associated with those couple of emission sources. Great initiative. Make sure that you get it really well communicated. You have great uptake for your EV scheme. And then your head of HR rolls up in a 3-litre diesel Range Rover. 2 seconds. That's how long it takes for the skeptics to notice. And they will notice, trust me, and they will talk. This kind of one visible act of hypocrisy can kind of undermine months of work. It isn't fair, maybe, but it is reality. That's exactly what happens. Now, this isn't about perfection. So leaders don't need to be net zero saints or whatever. That's not really the point. The point is to be intentional and consistent. Are they making visible choices that signal the organization's values are real and shared? So, making sure that your leaders choose sustainable travel modes. They go for rail over driving, or they don't take domestic flights within the UK, for example. Make sure they're opting into the same initiatives that they're asking their staff to adopt, and having carbon impact as a topic of discussion in their team meetings or their town halls, just as a normal part of business. It's something that you talk about alongside health and safety. It's something you talk about alongside financial performance. It's something you talk about alongside staff retention, whatever it might be. It's part of their leadership package, and they need to demonstrate best practice when they're talking about it. Remember, though, that not every member of staff needs to be convinced. Some will already be on board because they've got a personal interest in the topic, and some never will be because, for whatever reason, they just don't want to. Maybe they just don't think climate change is real. Maybe they don't think it's their responsibility to do anything about emissions at work, whatever. But the majority of people take their cues from the people above them. They're watching to see if this is real or if it's just a flash in the pan campaign or something. So leaders modeling the right behaviors is how you move that kind of big chunk of people in the middle, not by persuading them intellectually, but by making it feel like this is just how things are done around here. So what does this mean practically if you're kind of trying to get to grips with carbon reduction in your organization? So do a quick audit. Are your senior leaders making the right choices? Are they making the right travel choices? Are they making the right purchasing choices? Are they making the right choices in how they run their teams? And now those choices consistent with your carbon commitments? Are they talking about net zero as part of the normal business conversation? Or is it siloed into the sustainability team's world? You could consider using something like 360 feedback to understand how staff actually perceive leadership commitments to net zero. And you never know, the results might surprise you. So the phrase I use in the hackbook is the shadow leaders cast. Everything a leader does, what they say, what they spend money on, what they measure, what they celebrate, tells everyone in the organization what actually matters. Make sure your leader's shadows are pointing in the right direction. Okay, tip 3. Stop trying to convert everyone. I've already mentioned this in the previous tip, but it's a mindset shift. And honestly, for a lot of people working in sustainability, it's a relief to hear. You do not need to convince everyone. In fact, trying to do so is one of the biggest energy drains I see in organizations, and it actively takes focus away from the work that really moves the needle. So if you've been working on carbon reduction in your organization, you've almost certainly encountered the person who just does not want to engage. Maybe they're skeptical. Maybe they're actively obstructive. Maybe they just don't care. It's really tempting to put energy into winning those people over, particularly if they happen to be really vocal about it. It feels like the right thing to do, but it's often the wrong use of your time. Back in the day, in the early 60s, sociologist Everett Rogers published a model called the diffusion of innovations. And it describes how new ideas and behaviors spread through populations. And you'll have seen it. It's just a normal distribution curve, a bell curve. It's old, but it still holds up remarkably well. His model identifies 5 groups of people: some innovators, maybe about 2.5%, early adopters, 13.5%, the early majority, 34%, the late majority, another 34%, and the laggards, 16%. So the laggards are the ones who resist change, those people who are, actively trying to undo the work that you're doing, or just kind of very vocal about it. What's the point of this nonsense? And Roger's insight is that you may never convert them, and you probably shouldn't try too hard for that very reason. How does that apply to kind of carbon emissions? So, I mean, in your organization, there will be climate innovators, people who really get it, who are personally motivated, who will champion your initiatives without being asked. In fact, they might already be doing stuff that you think is a great idea. You just don't even know they're doing it. But there's also a large middle, the early and late middle majority, getting on for 70% of people who aren't particularly passionate either way, but will follow if the culture and structure supports it. And then there are the laggards, the actively resistant or the chronically disengaged. The mistake is often pouring your energy into the 16% at the back when the 68% in the middle are waiting to be led. What do you do instead? Lean into your innovators. Identify them, give them a platform, celebrate their contribution. Design your communications and initiatives to work for the middle majority. They don't need convincing on principle, they just need it to feel normal and supported. And when you do that, use existing channels rather than creating new ones. Co-op things that already exist. So don't add yet another newsletter, just add a carbon agenda item to the meetings that already happen. And make engaging with your carbon reduction strategy the path of least resistance, not an additional ask on top of everything else. I ought to say that this isn't about ignoring difficult people. The governance structures from tip 1 mean that accountability exists regardless of enthusiasm for those people towards the top of the organisation. The point is about where you direct your discretionary energy and enthusiasm. The governance handbook handles the laggards structurally. The leadership handbook handles culture with the middle majority. So the permission I want to give you here is this. It's okay to accept that not everyone will come with you willingly. Focus your energy on those who will, and use the governance structures to ensure that everybody else behaves consistently with your goals anyway. That's not giving up, that's being strategic. So there we have it, my top 3 tips for kickstarting carbon reduction in your organization, or getting it going again if it's stalled. So 1, build real accountability, not just responsibility. 2, make sure your leaders are walking the talk every single day. And 3, stop trying to convert everyone. Focus your energy where it will have the most impact. If any of this has resonated, I really encourage you to download the hackbooks, the governance hackbook and the leadership hackbook. Both are free and packed with practical hacks you can act on straight away. Just head on over to hut22.co.uk and click on free help to download those and other useful resources. If you find this useful, please share it with somebody who needs to hear it, whether that's a colleague, a client, or a leader in your organization who's wrestling with exactly these challenges. And don't forget, if you've enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, comment, and share it with friends. Until next time, guys.